Hello and welcome to the Frugal Kitchen. Today I am making some sugar cookies, but they're anti-sugar cookies. Maybe that's what I should have put in the front. They are completely sugar-free sugar cutout cookies with icing. And the sugar substitute I'm using is sucralose, just typical Splenda. The recipe comes from allrecipes.com and it does specify a quarter cup of stevia. I don't like stevia blend. I find it tastes, well, it tastes almost just like sucralose. It tastes a little bit earwaxy to me. So I'm just using what I have. It might be sweeter if you use a different type of sugar substitute. It does call for 1 stick of margarine or butter. I'm using margarine that happens to be vegan, but I believe I used an egg in this recipe, so this one's not vegan. So cream the butter and sugar together in a stand mixer. When it comes to sugar-free or sugar substitutes, I've used a lot of different varieties that I found to be the most affordable substitutes. There's the egg. 1 egg in the blender, not the blender, the stand mixer. So my sugar substitutes have been, I've used 2 alcohol sugars, erythritol and xylitol. Both of them have a very cold aftertaste. There's a, you know how alcohol feels cold after you touch it when it evaporates. So there's that when you eat. It also caused a lot of major digestive problems with me, the sort of problems where you can't leave the house. So I stopped using that, and then I switched to allulose, which is made from dates. And I thought that would be a better option, but it eventually, like after a month, made the same problems. So I just decided to stay with sucralose. It doesn't cause me any issues. I still have, regular digestive system. And I do put a little bit of real sugar in most of my recipes that use sucralose, just because sucralose is not really sweet at all, and the other sugar substitutes I had tried, I would consider them to be sweet. Then we're going to add in a teaspoon of vanilla extract. So this particular recipe has absolutely no sugar. I considered putting sugar as the icing and just leaving the base of the recipe sugar-free, but then I decided I wanted to know how it would taste without any sugar at all. So that's what this is. So this one does have flour in it. I am going to be putting in 1 1/4 cup of wheat flour. The recipe says all-purpose flour, but wheat flour is better for your A1C. So if you have a diabetic or pre-diabetic condition, you may want to stop using all-purpose flour. Wheat flour is also pretty much exactly like all-purpose flour as far as cooking goes. I haven't noticed any difference. The measuring cup I have here is a 1/4 cup, so 5/4 cups went into that bowl. And then a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. And then it'll be 1/2 teaspoon of baking powder. And then that is it for the base of the cookie recipe. You'll just blend all that in. So it looks like I mixed the wet ingredients first and then mix the dry ingredients with a whisk and then throw that into the stand mixer. I think I did it in 2 or 3 parts, which is typically recommended just so you don't make a mess and have too much lumps in it. Adding the rest of the flour mix in the stand mixer. This little plastic lid on it is something that my husband made. I mentioned in the chickpea blondie video that the stand mixer is something my husband bought before we met, which was 8 years ago. So this thing has been, I'm trying to think of a good way to put it, but I feel like he's like a warrior, going out into the battlefield every weekend when I need to bake something and delivering 100%. But that lid is basically that lid with the inside cut out of it. So he bought a second one so he could use it to just keep things less messy. So what you're going to do is cover the bowl and then refrigerate it for 30 minutes. The recipe said to cover it with plastic like saran wrap. I don't do that, so we're using that plastic lid. I don't like throwing things away, so anytime a recipe says parchment paper or cover it with this, I'll kind of use my best judgment on whether that's what I want to do. So now I'm making the icing, and I'm making half the recipe's quantity because that's how I am when it comes to icing. So it says 3 tablespoons of sugar. I believe that is 9 half teaspoons, so 4.5 teaspoons. And I'm trying to turn it into powdered sugar, and this is usually how I turn it into powdered sugar. I throw it in the Vitamix and my sugar turns into powdered sugar, but I didn't have enough, so it kind of made this weird tornado effect and shot all my sugar up to the top of the blender, and it was kind of gritty. So I put it back in and I thought, well, maybe I should make the whole quantity of icing. So I believe that is what I did. I'm looking at the list of ingredients now, and I think I ended up doing it that way. Or maybe I just added sugar and then, yeah, I just added more sugar. I said, whatever, it'll just make it sweeter, which is a dumb thing to say when you're using sucralose because it's honestly not really sweet. But I needed to make more. So I think that what my plan was at this point was to just save the extra powdered sugar for something else. I think my husband suggested that, which I was going to do. So yes, you can see it's powdered, but I ended up having to use it all, and you will see why very soon. So I'm doing 9 half teaspoons again into a new bowl to make half the quantity of icing that the recipe calls for. I don't know why I keep doing that, making half the quantity of icing. I think it makes sense for things like cake and cupcakes because usually you'll see like a mountain of icing on them, but I'm not sure it makes that much sense for cookies that, for the most part, you can't over ice these kind of cookies. So the instructions here for the icing are kind of split. I made powdered sugar, and then I'm going to make the icing later. So this is, I'm going to roll out the dough. The 30 minutes are just about up. And the green things are 1/4 inch thick spacers for your rolling pin. I am planning eventually on buying some 1/8 inch spacers for the rolling pin so I can make crackers, because I have a problem with crackers now not being evenly cooked. And my husband had bought, this is also his, he was the cook when we met. I like to cook and I did a lot of things, but he had a lot of cooking tools that I never bothered to own because I don't know, used other things or just decided I could stir things by hand, which is pretty much what I did all the time. So this is his, and he had an 1/8 inch thick spacers, but then got rid of them, or a 1/4 inch thick. No, this is a 1/4. So it was the 1/8 inch he threw out, or he got rid of, or he donated. And I found out about this a week ago, and I thought, oh my god, I had no idea that you separated a set. I don't like separating sets. So he did that before we met, and if he had just not done that, I would have had perfect crackers. All these times I've been making crackers. So I rolled this out between 2 sheets of parchment paper. I know I don't like to waste parchment paper. I literally just told you about that like half a minute ago. But I do it a lot for this because I can wash the parchment paper. It doesn't like get messed up, the wrong size, crumbled up and stuff, wrinkled. So I typically will do that for rolling it out because otherwise I'm going to have to throw a bunch of flour on the thing and it doesn't work as well. This is a ferret-shaped cookie cutter. You may not know this, but I've owned ferrets for 17 years. You probably don't know this because I don't talk about them that much. I do have a recipe for making ferret duck soup that's quite popular on this channel, but aside from that, I'm not cooking for the ferrets on a regular basis. That's pretty much all I ever cook. So this and a snowman are the only cookie cutouts I have besides like a set of round ones. And I just thought, why not use the ferret ones? Like, there's no reason to not use the fairer ones. So I just figured I'd do that for this video. The round ones would have been, I suppose, easier to ice maybe. It would have looked better when they were done. But who doesn't love a ferret? One thing a lot of recipes don't tell you, at least for cookies, is how many you should yield when you're making them. I really like to have 24 cookies when I'm baking. I feel like a dozen's definitely not enough, and sometimes I ended up with 18, so that's 1.5 dozen. In this one, there's, like 10 ferrets and two circles that I made, because I didn't want to keep rolling out ferret pictures. And then I'm baking them for 11 minutes at 350 degrees. The recipe says to do it 10 to 12 minutes or until golden. One thing with sugar substitutes is the cookies will not spread. Sugar makes cookies spread out. So the size of the cookies is pretty much how it will be when it's completed. So now we're continuing on to the icing. This is half a recipe, or half the quantity that the recipe calls for. So for my version, that's 2 tablespoons of butter or margarine, 4 tablespoons of cornstarch, which I believe is a 1/4 cup of cornstarch. And then is that half a teaspoon of vanilla? The original recipe called for 1/2 cup of cornstarch, and I thought, well, Jesus Christ, that's like all of my cornstarch that's left in the house. Why do I need this much cornstarch? And I kept looking for recipes that didn't involve cornstarch but were also sugar-free icing. And then I realized that the reason the cornstarch is in there, because you may know it's not in a regular sugar icing recipe, the reason it's in there is because otherwise the icing will just be pretty much water. It won't hold shape. So the cornstarch is necessary, and then I had to add, is that 2 tablespoons of water? The water isn't, okay. So the recipe calls for a 1/4 cup of milk, which I thought was quite a lot of milk. And I said, I don't need milk, I'm going to just use water. So you could make this vegan if you substituted the egg with your favorite vegan substitute and then just used water for the icing. I don't think milk added anything to it. So here is how it ended up the first time around. It's pretty thick, I think, good for spreading. Yeah, it's like a good consistency, and that cornstarch is the whole reason it is that consistency. I think with the sugar substitute, it wouldn't do what it's supposed to do. It wouldn't make proper icing. But I decided to throw in the rest of my sugar because I didn't have enough, and then I threw in a little more water. I was like, well, that's not enough icing, so I should have made a full recipe, but I didn't want to use a whole 1/2 cup of cornstarch. I thought that was just too much. It's just like, this is going to be me eating cornstarch. So I'm just throwing in a little bit more water and sugar to see how the consistency is. And then I cut this part out, but I added some food coloring too. So yeah, it's kind of watery here. I don't know if I think I added more cornstarch to it. Yep. I didn't have any more powdered sugar left, so I thought, okay, the only way to thicken it, since there's no sugar, is to add some cornstarch. So for this recipe, even with the few cookies I ended up having, like I said, there's 12 cookies. That's ridiculous. That's not enough cookies. Even with that small amount, I still think that I should have done the full icing recipe. So please do it. Buy a new container of cornstarch if you need to, or use real sugar if that is not a problem for you, and you will have more success than I did with my tiny little amount of icing. And it doesn't look like I measured the cornstarch when I was adding it after messing with the quantity of sugar and water, but I would say try to add a tablespoon at a time if you're doing it my way, but also don't do it my way. So I asked my husband what color icing to make, and he said green. And I thought, okay, green's fine. But then I said, let me add some blue to make it a little teal. So that's coming up soon. So these are the finished cookies. They look fine. They definitely don't look brown like cookies normally do when they come out of the oven, but that is also because there's no sugar. So at this point, the cookies have been cooling for a while, and I'm just checking them to make sure they're all relatively cold. You don't really want to ice hot cookies. It's not going to be a good time. The icing was very difficult to spread. I tried making a teal colored icing, and I didn't have enough icing, and it was very liquidy because of how I kind of messed up the whole ratio. But if you're liking the recipe so far, please like, share, and subscribe because the original recipe is quite good. So I don't know if it's a quality of the sugar substitute, but these cookies that I cut out are like the best shape that any of my Ferret sugar cookies have ever been. Usually they're missing tails, the tails break off and things kind of deform. But in this case, they all look like decent ferrets. So you want to let the icing dry for a while before you try testing it. It does have a nice shiny, like royal icing look, probably because of the cornstarch. So it's firm and hard, so I'm going to take a taste test of the Ferret cookie. And it was good, but it wasn't sweet. It was not a sugar cookie because there was no sugar. And because the sugar substitute I used was not sweet like the original recipe called for. But it's still delicious, and I feel like a very good option for someone who needs a sugar-free cookie. And I think I will definitely make these again. Happy eating, everyone!